I want to take the opportunity to welcome you back. After we've taken a break for about 3 months, as we were discussing earlier, and continuing our series in understanding the Old Testament. So, believe it or not, when we began this journey, we started in Genesis. And before we took our break for 3 months, we went all the way to the minor prophet, Hosea. So we've come through all of that part of the Old Testament, and now we're taking the opportunity to pick back up, and we're going to dive right in as if we never had taken a break, and we're going to dive right into the next minor prophet. Now, just to give you a little bit of a recap again, understand what's happening when we are dealing with the minor prophets. Remember, the kingdom of Israel is divided, right? There's the 10 tribes of Israel to the north, the 2 tribes of Judah to the south. And remember, they divided up shortly after the death of King Solomon. And we went through the major prophets, which talked about the coming exile of both Israel and Judah. Remember, they would be taken captivity. Israel would be taken captivity by the Assyrians. Judah would be taken captivity by the Babylonians. And so as we went through the major prophets, and now as we go through the minor prophets, we're in that time of turmoil, okay, for the nation of Israel being split. We're in that time of turmoil with all of that. And so each of these minor prophets that we'll work through will be concentrating on a particular part of the kingdom and a particular time of the exile with regard to both nations, both parts of the nation of Israel. So tonight, as we go in and begin with Joel, again, a minor prophet. The reason why we call him a minor prophet is because it's only a 3-chapter book. And you'll find as we go through the rest of the minor prophets that they're small books. There's not many chapters, and that's essentially the reason why they're called minor prophets. They are talking minorly, while the major prophets that we talk about, the 4 major prophets, do major work in their prophetic work. These ones only do minor work. Not meaning that they're less important, but talking about the content. So, when we talk about Joel, we remind ourselves that he was the prophet who focused his message primarily on this theme. You've probably heard this theme before, the great and terrible day of the Lord. Okay, that was his major focus, and as we go a little further in our study, we will see what he means by that great and terrible day of the Lord. His book of just 3 chapters is a clear presentation. It's also a strong presentation of the world history view, and here's the world history view, that all history will be culminating in Christ. Okay, that's the world history view from the biblical viewpoint, okay? All history is progressing toward a culminating point. That culminating point is Jesus Christ, and because Joel is a minor prophet, he also in his book will be concentrating on the fact that Israel plays a prominent role in end-time events, okay? So now with Joel, we're starting to get into the prophecies of God, not just with regard to the ones that he's ministering to, but also with regard to what's going to be happening after the New Testament times are completed, okay? But Joel doesn't know anything, of course, about the New Testament times because he's not in that time period of history. But Joel's prophecies will concentrate on that. R.A. Stewart said this about the book of Joel. He said this, it's one of the most disturbing and heart-searching books of the Old Testament. In other words, basically, here's what he's saying. Joel's message was not popular with the masses, and Joel's message was rather one that had an impact in the people's minds and hearts. And we'll see that as we get into the background of the book and the background of Joel and so on. But before we do that, let's see how we outline this book. Now again, just 3 chapters, so if you decided this week that you wanted to read the book of Joel, it wouldn't take long because there's only 3 chapters. So you can't even do a chapter a day or else you'll already be done, right? But let's look at it this way. The first part just covers the first 20 verses, or actually just chapter 1, of Joel, and we would call it the day of the Lord in retrospect. In other words, what Joel is talking about here is events that happened in the past for the nation as they're under the judgment of God. And so this is when he's talking about the past days when the locusts came and ravaged the land. They were not able to grow any crops because of what the locusts done. Not only did the locusts ravage the land, but also they found themselves in severe drought conditions. This was prior to Joel writing his book. And so in the first chapter, what he does is he reviews with the people what has already happened. Talking about the plague of the locusts, talking about the plague of drought, where they were not having a good go of it. Then in chapters 2 and 3, he then talks about the day of the Lord in prospect. What we mean by that is now he looks toward the future. Specifically, talking not just about the exile of the people that he's ministering to, but he's also going to be talking about the imminent and ultimate day of the Lord. That phrase again, day of the Lord. And you'll find that that phrase keeps coming up time and time again as you read through those 3 chapters. So keep this in mind. We're not just talking about the days and times of Joel, but Joel will also talk about the days and times when world history will come to a common end, come to a final end, and Christ will return. And he will be talking about that as well. As far as background is concerned, let's begin with the man himself. Let's begin with the prophet, where we talk about Joel. And we have to just say this honestly right up front. Very little is known about this prophet. We do not know a lot about him at all. And other than what we can gain basically from the text. For example, if we go to verse 1, chapter 1, we know that Joel, whose name means Jehovah is God, okay, was the son of Pethuel, okay, and his name meant persuaded of God. Kind of interesting comparing the 2 names together. Pethuel, the father, persuaded of God. Joel, being Jehovah is God. If you read verse 1 of chapter 1, it just simply says this: the word of the Lord that came to Joel, the son of Pethuel. Okay? So that's about all we know. In fact, it's quite interesting. His father's name, Pethuel, it's the only time you'll find it in the Bible. we don't come across that name ever again. It's the only appearance of it in the Bible. But the name Joel itself was very common. It was a very common name in the Old Testament times. In fact, if you were to go through the scriptures, you would find the name Joel referring to about 12 different people in the scriptures. Okay, so Joel in the scriptures is not just confined to one person. Pethuel is only one person, but Joel was a very common name in the Old Testament. We know that Joel lived in Judah, okay, the lower part of the nation of Israel, right? Jerusalem being its center, okay? Joel lived in Judah, and in fact, possibly lived in Jerusalem itself. And we feel that he most likely lived during the time of King Joash, okay? Now, when we went through the kings, when we were going through Old Testament history, the historical books, we, went really quickly through some of those kings. As we go a little further, you'll remember who Joash was. He was one that was significant for a couple of reasons. Now, some think, and I think they have a good argument here, some think that he was a priest, one of the priests that served in the temple in Jerusalem, when God called him to be a prophet. Okay? So he was serving the people already in the temple, and then God called him to come out of the temple service and be the prophet for his sake. Another prophet to Judah was Obadiah. We haven't covered him yet, but we'll get to him when his turn comes. Obadiah was Judah's prophet just before Joel appeared on the scene. So it's almost like Obadiah was the prophet to Judah, and then once his ministry was over, that's when God called Joel in to take Obadiah's place. All right, so that kind of gives you a bit of a timeline there. Which then gets us to the next point where we want to talk about the book of Joel itself. Now that we've told you basically all that we know about Joel, let's talk about the book and do some background work there. Let's talk about when it was written, or when we feel it was written. If indeed Joel lived during the reign of King Joash, then he was one of the earliest writing prophets. Again, remember, the order of the prophets that we have in our Old Testament Bibles, they don't come in the order of when those prophets appeared on the scene in their ministries. They are arranged in the way that they are for a different reason. So Joel, in the grand scheme of things, especially if he lived during the reign of King Joash, and we believe that he did, then he would be one of the earliest writers in the prophetic time that was going on. And with that being the case, then, we would estimate that probably Joel wrote his book somewhere around 820 BC. All right? Now, there are some who want to prefer the view that Joel lived after the Babylonian exile. Okay, so after Nebuchadnezzar came in, took over Jerusalem, and took all the people away back to Babylon. There's some reason for thinking that, but for our purposes, we're not going to get into the big argument about it all. But for our purposes, what we're going to talk about is Joel living during the time of King Joash, because if that is indeed the case, then that helps us to understand even more clearly the setting of what is taking place in Joel's life as he ministers. First of all, let's talk about the political setting along with the religious setting. The reason why we put those together is, remember, there is no separation of church and state for Israel. Now, the king is to be the representative of God, although they're not doing very well in that area. And the temple and the temple worship is still going on, even though there is idol worship taking place as well. Both are intermixed together, and so that's why we talk about the political scene along with the religious scene. And you might remember that Joash was king of Judah when Joel ministered as the nation's prophet, and he ministered as king for about 40 years, because he was only 7 years old. Joash was only 7 years old when he came to take the throne in the kingdom of Judah. And because he was so young, his guardian instructor in those early years was the godly high priest by the name of Jehoiada. Now, if you want all the details with regard to that, 2 Kings chapters 11 and 12 will remind you of that era where King Joash was doing his thing, and how, again, Jehoiada guided Joash in his early years of his reign. And we call him the godly high priest Jehoiada because that's indeed who he was. He was one that helped Joash understand the ways and the means of God, introduced him to the law, all the rest of those good things. And it was up until Jehoiada's death, it was until his death that Joash's reign was mainly what we would call a righteous one. Okay? He basically was a good king and did good things. Let's take just a minute and let's go back to 2 Kings. We'll remind ourselves a little bit of that. 2 Kings, it's been a little while since we were there, but it will take us an opportunity. 2 Kings chapter 12. Notice what they say about Joash, or depending on your translation, you might have the name Jehoash. It's all the same king we're talking about here. Joash did what was right in the sight of the Lord all the days in which Jehoiada the priest instructed him. Okay? So we see that influence that Jehoiada had in Joash's life, but it also implies in that verse that did not go all the way through Joash's reign. Notice verse 3, but the high places were not taken away. The people still sacrificed and burned incense on the high places. And this would be, after Jehoiada is gone, this would be part of Joash's downfall. So when Jehoiada indeed had died, Then he defected to the idolatrous ways of the people. In fact, he even was guilty of making sure that after Jehoiada was dead and gone, he made sure that his son, who would also take on the priestly role, okay, because his father was a priest, okay, serving the temple, he made sure that Jehoiada's son was assassinated or was killed, okay. So that shows you the influence that Jehoiada had, and then once Jehoiada is gone, the influence that was taking place in Joash's life after this godly influence is gone. So then, with all of that taking place, we would say that Joel probably wrote his book while Joash was still a minor, okay, and still under Jehoiada's tutelage. Still when the reign was going fairly well, although again idol worship was part of what was going on there as well. Now, I think this would partly account for the absence in Joel of what the major prophets often did, where they would go into what we would call these long descriptions of national sin. For example, if you take a look at Isaiah, or if you take a look at Jeremiah, maybe you read through them when we went through them in our evenings together. You may recall these long chapters, right, or lots of verses where Isaiah and Jeremiah lament about the national sin that's taking place, right? You won't find that in Joel's book. He doesn't talk a lot about it at all. And we believe that the reason for that is because of when Joel wrote his book. Again, Joash's reign was fairly righteous because of the influence of Jehoiada in his life. During Joash's reign, though, Judah was not free from the threat of invasion by foreigners. Again, if you were to go to 2 Kings chapter 12 and 2 Chronicles chapter 24, this reminds you of the threat that Joash had to deal with during his reign as king. And the threat that they were dealing with then was the kingdom of Syria, and wanting to come in and wreak havoc and so on. Syria didn't have much success, but still that was on the radar of Joash's reign while he was on the throne. So there you have the political setting, you have the religious setting. Basically, we could maybe describe it this way. Religiously speaking, things are on the brink. We haven't gone totally over the precipice yet into idol worship, but by the time Jehoiada is gone, we will go that way. Politically speaking, we haven't gone over the precipice of being under the oppression of a foreign power, but Syria is knocking on the door. Okay, so things are tentative. Things are tense. Nobody's comfortable. Not even Joash. And to add into this political and religious setting, then you also have to deal with the economic setting of what is taking place, which then helps you to understand a little bit more of why Joel says and writes the things that he does. Because during this time, there were severe plagues that would take place in the land of Judah, severe plagues of locusts that would go about the land and basically destroy, as locusts do, all of the vegetation that would have been growing if it was growing. Not only did they have to deal with plagues of locusts, they had to deal with drought. There were no rains. You'll find that Joel talks about, in his book, he'll talk about the latter rains, okay, not coming, okay, referring to the droughts. And with both of these things going on, it just devastated the land of Judah. And this was the time, this was the economic time when Joel is penning his prophecies, okay, of the great and terrible day of the Lord. In fact, it's interesting, when we go to verse 2 of chapter 1, it's interesting this question that Joel asks the elders of Judah at the beginning of his prophetic book. He says, has anything like this happened in your days or in your father's days? And it's basically a rhetorical question. The answer is no. We've never seen anything like this before. By implication, what Joel is saying is this. Listen, since this has never happened before, since you've never experienced this before, maybe somebody's trying to get your attention. What do you think? What do you think? And if you think he's trying to get your attention, you ain't seen anything yet, because we still have to deal with what we call the great and terrible day of the Lord. Okay? And so this is why Joel's message wasn't what you would call a feel-good message. There weren't television's networks clamoring to try and get the rights to his weekly broadcasts. He wasn't selling books. He wasn't on the radio programs. You know what I'm talking about? His message was not a popular one. It was considered to be a negative one, and it was gaining the attention of the people, although the attention that he would receive would be negative attention. So, Joel, we would say this, could not have used a better symbol than this to prefigure the coming of what we call the terrible day of the Lord. This is just kids' play in comparison to what is to come. Okay? And so Joel was probably referred to by the community as one of those crazy kooks, right? As they had to deal with the issues that they had to deal with. Joel's writing style, though, and you may notice this as you read it, Joel's writing style is a smooth style, which is somewhat unusual for an Old Testament prophet. Not only is his style smooth, but his writing is also what we call vivid. You can envision what it is that he's writing and what it is that he's talking about, and we would call, for example, the book of Joel one of the literary gems of the Old Testament. Okay, if you want to try and get a grasp of good Hebrew writing, our English text will not pick up all the nuances, but it picks up a lot of it, and we see the vividness and the smoothness of his communication. But why was Joel speaking the things that he was speaking? For what purpose? Well, first of all, he was responsible to foretell the coming judgments that the Lord would place upon Judah as a result, again, of their sin. What was their sin? Idolatry. Okay? Mainly, idolatry. A rejection of the law of God and going after the laws and the gods of the nations round about them. So that was one of the things that he was doing. He was talking about the coming judgments that would take place by the Lord upon the people of Judah. Also, what he was doing at the same time was he was exhorting Judah to turn their hearts to the Lord. They wouldn't, okay? But still, the purpose behind his message was to say, listen, judgment's coming. We can divert this judgment. We can forestall this judgment. We can avoid this judgment if you would turn from the idols and turn back to God. Now again, we know that they didn't do that. But this again is the purpose behind Joel's message. But we have to understand a third part, or a third purpose in his message as well. And it was this. What he was called to do was to impress upon all the people, not just the people of Judah, but even us now, okay? To impress upon all the people that this world's history, the historical times that we are in, will culminate in the events of what he calls the day of the Lord. All of world history, from the very beginning of time when we began to talk about it in Genesis, all of the world history God has a purpose behind it. It begins at Genesis and it is going toward a final point. It is going toward a culmination point. God has a purpose in mind with regard to this history that he began. It's not just going to go on forever and ever. It's not just going to be cyclical in its portrayal, but it is racing toward a culmination point, which he calls the day of the Lord. And this will be the time when the day of the Lord comes, that, as we would say it this way, the scales of justice will finally rest. Remember in the beginning when God created the heavens and the earth, as it talks about in Genesis 1 and 2, when it comes to the final time where God completes his creative act, do you remember what Moses writes with regard to how God viewed his creative act and what he said about it? He said, "And behold, it was very good." What did Moses mean by that? What he meant was that the creative act of God was complete. There was nothing more that he could add to it. It was in the state and in the place that God had always intended it to be. It was good. It was complete. It was the fulfillment of his desire and dream as he created the world and all that is in it, including the human creation. In Genesis chapter 3, as Moses records it for us, when we see the fall of humanity, when we see Adam and Eve make the decision that they make to rebel against God's plan, what happens? It turns everything on its ear. What God had intended now is changed. It's not God who has changed it. It's humanity who has changed it. So that by the time we get to Genesis chapter 6, what does Moses record about that point of human history and what the human creation is doing? All that they were doing in the sight of God was evil all the time. It had been turned on its ear. It continues to be turned on its ear even to this point today, right? Not everything is right. Not everything is complete. Not everything is perfect. Not everything is at rest. It's when Jesus Christ comes back again, and we see this now that we have the New Testament to complement the Old Testament. What we see is that there is coming a day, and this is what we're talking about with regard to world history speeding toward a culminating point. When Christ returns, when God returns, the one who created all of this in the beginning, when he returns again, that's when everything will be brought back to what it was always intended to be. This, in a nutshell, basically then, is Joel's message. We're racing toward a culmination point when God will make it right again. But to get there, we have to deal with the great and terrible day of the Lord. It's not a cakewalk. It's not an escape into that. No. There's things that we have to endure and go through in preparation for that day when it comes. So then let's talk about this day of the Lord, this phrase that Joel uses. In fact, in the 3 chapters that he writes, 5 times this phrase, the day of the Lord, appears. Now, you've heard me say this before, right? If you find a word or a phrase that is repeated often in the text, what's the point? God is trying to make a point. Okay? So this whole factor of the day of the Lord, talked about 5 times in 3 chapters. Obviously, this is something important that we need to listen to. And when Joel uses this phrase, the day of the Lord, what he's doing is he's using this phrase to refer to end times. Not just the times of the people of Judah that he's dealing with now, but he's talking about the end times that even we, in our New Testament era of history, are still waiting for as well. Now, I don't think Joel understood the full dynamic of that, but he certainly knew this much, that world history is racing toward a culmination. And it will be that time when God will return. It's interesting, even when the New Testament writers referred to that day, the terrible day of the Lord, for example, in 2 Thessalonians 2, Paul wrote that. 2 Peter 3, Peter wrote that. Even the New Testament writers referred to this day of the Lord, as still future. So they were still waiting for that day. Even though this was Joel's prophecy, back in the Old Testament, they were reading that and understanding this is still a future time. So Paul and Peter understood that we hadn't come to that point yet. In the Old Testament, we find that this phrase, the day of the Lord, occurs over 30 times. Okay? If you're going to find it that often, obviously there is something to take note of here. Now I haven't put all 30 references down there, but notice how often we have it. We have it in Isaiah, we have it in Joel, we have it in Amos, we have it in Ezekiel, we even have it in Zephaniah. Okay? And we haven't talked about, Amos is the next one we'll deal with. We haven't talked about Amos yet. We talked about Ezekiel, we haven't talked about Zephaniah yet, we've been through Isaiah, but we find this phrase in the Old Testament, Day of the Lord, occurs over 30 times. And when it talks about that, this day that we're referring to, we're talking about judgment. We're talking about war. But specifically, judgment and war against sinners. This battle that will take place between God and the rulers of the nations of the world. That final battle, so to speak, that will take place where again God will finally make things right. God will defeat those world leaders. God will defeat the ruler of those world leaders. God will defeat all of that rebellion. And this judgment and this war is necessary because before righteousness can reign, you have to clean house. Okay? And that's basically what this day of the Lord is about. It's about cleaning house. So that we can set things, or not we, but so that God can indeed set things right again. What's interesting about this time period as well is that the saints of God, okay, both Old Testament as well as New Testament saints, right? By the way, in case you didn't know, if you're a follower of Jesus Christ, guess what? You're a saint. Saints are involved in this day in the sense that when the Lord brings judgment upon unbelievers, what are the saints doing? We are associated with God in this victory. Okay? When Christ comes again, he will not come by himself, but he will come with his saints. Somehow, some way, if we go to be with Christ before he comes back again, we will be involved in the process. Even though, as Joel refers to it, it is still referred to as the great and terrible day of the Lord. Now, the question that we haven't asked yet is, all right, since we know the characteristics of this day of the Lord, when is that to be?
I'm a friend who thinks soon.
What's that?
I'm a friend who thinks soon.
Okay, yes. Yes, and it very well could be. When we talk about the time, when will the day of the Lord begin? There are basically four major views that are out there, okay, with regard to that. Now, we're not going to take the time, because we don't have the time, we're not going to take the time to get into all of the pros and cons of each of those views, but we will at least show you what those views are. For example, some believe this about the day of the Lord and when it will begin. Some would say that Joel's prophecies of the day of the Lord are about the Messianic kingdom at the end of the world. Okay, when Christ returns to set up his earthly kingdom. That's what we call the Messianic kingdom, right? Which will begin, okay, this Messianic kingdom, when God's final judgments will fall upon unbelieving nations, and when believing Israel will be delivered from their enemies. Okay? So that's one particular view as to when the day of the Lord will begin. When God comes back to set up his earthly kingdom and conquers the nations, and Israel, believing Israel, okay, not all of Israel, but believing Israel, will be delivered indeed from their enemies. Some would say that they want to be a little more specific, that this day of the Lord prophecy that Joel's talking about, it begins at what they call the rapture, when the tribulation begins. Okay, so there are some who would say that there is coming a time when the church itself will be raptured up or raptured away, where the New Testament saints go to be with Christ in eternity, And then once they go to be with Christ, that's when what we call the tribulation period begins, where all the judgments of God come out upon the world that are described in the book of Revelation. Remember the seven seals, right, and the seven bowls and the seven trumpets, all the judgments of God. They would say, there's your beginning of the great and terrible day of the Lord.
Is that 1,000 years? How does that?
No, the Messianic kingdom is 1,000 years.
That's 1,000 years.
Yeah, the Messianic kingdom is 1,000 years. They would say that these people would say that the day of the Lord begins when the rapture ends and the tribulation begins. There are some who want to be a little more finite, and they say, well, it will be shortly after the rapture. The great and terrible day of the Lord will be shortly after the rapture, but during the tribulation. Okay? Some would even say that it will be at the halfway point of the 7-year tribulation when the great and terrible day of the Lord comes. Okay? Then the fourth view, the great and terrible day of the Lord will be at the Revelation, or what we would call the second coming. Right? When God comes back, when Christ defeats his foes at the battle of Armageddon. Okay? Now, perhaps you've already noticed that of all these four views, all of them overlap at certain points, right? Did you notice that? All of them kind of overlap at certain points. All this to say the following. We know that the great and terrible day of the Lord is coming. We may not have the beginning part of it may be down pat, but we know that it is coming. Let's let history show us which of those views maybe is correct, or maybe none of them are. Right? But let's let history show us which view is going to be. In the meantime, while we're waiting for the great and terrible day of the Lord, let us be involved in preparation for that. That, I think, is the key for us. Okay? Rather than getting wrapped up in all of the argumentation for all the views, the primary thing that is our responsibility is, are we ready for when that day comes? Do we have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ? And are we continuing to communicate that message of Christ to others as we have received it ourselves? That's what's of primary importance. God will take care of the day of the Lord himself. That's why it's called the great and terrible day of the Lord. It's his day. We will let him take care of it when it's time for him to take care of it. What I'm going to be involved in, as I follow Christ, is sharing the message of Jesus Christ for all who need to hear before we come to that time. You understand what I'm saying there? Sometimes in the church, we have a tendency to get distracted and spend a lot of time and energy trying to pinpoint things when that's not our responsibility. Our responsibility is to communicate the message. Okay? Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that none of these are important. I'm not saying that this isn't important. All I'm saying is let's not get distracted with things that waste a lot of time, whereby we're concentrating more on this than communicating the message. Okay? I think that's one of the reasons why Joel doesn't give us detail as to when this actually begins. Joel didn't know when it was going to begin. But what was he telling the people of Judah? You need to make some changes, because the great and terrible day of the Lord is coming. Well, you know what the final question is, right? You already know this because we're in the habit now. We got to deal with the so what question, right? This little 3-chapter book, okay? It deals with, again, prophetic history. It's dealing with a nation that was basically preparing to go into exile. Joel's message is a message of ancient history, we could say. Does it have significance for us today, in this day and age in which we live? That's a great question, and that's why we ask the question every time we come to the end of a book that we're doing. I want us to deal with the so what question, so that we see that even though it is an ancient text, it still has relevance for us even today. I think one of the things that we want to be reminded of is this. God is sovereign. What we mean by that is that God and his intended plan for his creation and his human creation especially is predetermined. And because it is predetermined, He is the one who has the authority with regard to the path in which all of this world history will take place. Its times, its seasons, its influences, all the rest of it. Right now we're living in a day and age of great fear and confusion, right? Especially when we see how many, literally hundreds of thousands of people are escaping particular areas of the world like Syria and Iraq, risking their lives in a lot of cases, sometimes giving their lives in a lot of cases, and trying to escape those regions of the world and coming by the hundreds of thousands into European nations. And you've seen it on your television, right? The great migrant groups of people that are traveling down railway tracks, trying to cross bodies of water, trying to crawl underneath razor wire fences to try and get to a place that they think is going to be better for them. This is no surprise to God. It does not shock him. It does not cause him to be concerned in the sense of not knowing what's going on. He knows exactly what's going on. This is part of what needs to happen and take place as world history continues to go toward that point of the great and terrible day of the Lord. How that fits into the overall grand scheme of things, we do not know. We don't have those details. But Joel reminds us, just as he reminded the people of Judah in his day, and he reminds us as we would read the text now today, that God's plan, that plan of world history culminating at the point of his return, that great and terrible day of the Lord, that's all in his control. So rather than fear the way some of us are doing in this world, especially when we see the people and the migration that's taking place, rather than fear, our response as followers of Christ is, okay, even though I don't know what is going on, I recognize that God is sovereign, he's in control, and now I need to be asking myself this question. As I see what is going on, and as I see the plan of God continuing on, what must I, as his follower, be doing in response? Where do I fit in? How do I become involved? How do I continue to share the message of Jesus Christ to a needy world? Now, isn't that interesting perspective? You know, it's interesting, and there's controversy about it, of course, but there's a Lutheran church in Germany that in the last 3 months has grown from 50 people to over 600. Do you know why? Because the Muslim immigrants that are coming into Germany are converting over to Christianity by the dozens. Now, the question is, why are they doing that? Some would say the reason why they're doing that is so that will help them in their immigration status. If I'm now a Christian and Germany wants to extradite me back to my homeland, which is Muslim, now I'm going to be under religious persecution if I go back. So there are some people who are saying that's the reason why they're converting. There's other people who are saying they're converting out of genuine recognition of the one true God. I would have a tendency to think that there's both going on. Okay. To what degree and what ratios, I do not know. But isn't it interesting how that is taking place? What would it mean for us, even in our own country here, if we were to be involved in making arrangements to bring in immigrants of these people, right? And I use that term positively, not negatively. But become involved in bringing them to this country as a demonstration of our faith in Jesus Christ, whereas we are involved in the lives we earn the opportunity now to talk about our faith in Jesus Christ? Could it be that God would use that for his purposes? I dare say so. I dare say so. See, when we understand that God is sovereign and he's in control, that takes that fear away. And now we can look at it from the perspective that God wants us to look at. How do I become involved and communicate the message of Jesus Christ in God's grand scheme of things, where we're going toward the culminating point of world history? We're not just a spectator. We're a participant now. The other thing that I think we are reminded of as well is that, you know what? God is one who still engages in the work of restoration. Even by the time that Joel is ministering, some would say, you know what? They've gone beyond the point of no return. Joel, your ministry is of no consequence. It's like talking to the wind. There's no substance. There's no change taking place. But yet God continues to remind the people through the prophet Joel. Even when the great and terrible day of the Lord comes, what is God doing? What will God be doing? Bringing restoration. What he had intended at the beginning of world history will be restored at the end of world history. God is still involved and engaged in the work of restoration. Even though things seem to be at 6s and 7s. Even though things are in a chaotic mess, it looks like, right? No. Even though it may look like that on the surface, we understand the underlying current of what's going on. It's all pointing toward that culminating point of world history. God has a purpose. God has a plan in mind. And he will be engaged in the work of restoration. We may not see it, but our view is so narrow compared to how God sees the grand scheme of things. That's why we can say with confidence, let's not be worried. Let's not be fearful. Let's continue in the hope and the confidence that is ours in Jesus Christ. He's still in control. He's still at the helm. He knows what he's doing. Let's see how we can become involved in his grand scheme. There's Joel. A little 3-chapter book that talks about the culmination of world history. It wasn't just for the people of Judah. It's for us today. And it reminds us today how God continues to be at work. Next time we're together, we'll deal with another minor prophet. Until then, let's pray. And then we will go from here. Thank you, Father, again for your word. Thank you that it reminds us of some very important things. And we thank you that this world in which we live in, its culmination, as quick as it is coming, is still all under your control. And we continue to be a people who need to rest in you rather than be fearful of the future. Father, we thank you that you know all of what is going on. Father, help us as your people to be ready and willing and involved in your plan in whatever way that you would have us involved. And as we do that, we will give you the glory. In Jesus' name, amen.